Autumn has come. The end of November is here. Well, close enough to it as it is. The trees have changed colors, many leaves have fallen. The air is chilly. Faint notes of the foreboding winter coming barreling at us. It's delightful. I love it. I love autumn and winter. Everything's so beautiful. The air is crisp. And so long as the weather doesn't forget what time of year it is, you don't sweat anymore. I hope you're all comfortable with a drink, maybe a snack. It is time for another story. Tonight, we present to you a fantasy, a dark, beautiful, post-apocalyptic fantasy, titled Cry for Me. This is only the first chapter. I hope you enjoy it. So get comfortable, grab a blanket, close the window, and, if you would care for a little ambience, crack those windows just a little. Let that cool air waft in. The smell, the feel of autumn. Light a candle. Turn off all the lights and enjoy the dim glow as you listen to Cry for Me, Chapter 1, The Last War, a Realm Tale by Keys Troy. "Hey, Grandpa," Kolya said excitedly as he and his sister Ashley ran into the room. "Oh, hi," Daniel, their mother's father, said with a warm smile. "What's the rush about?" "Mom told us to tell you to tell us about the castle," said Ashley just as excitedly. "Oh, really now?" Daniel said with a chuckle. He leaned forward in his chair and set his coffee down on the table beside him. "How old are you two now?" "Come on, Grandpa. You know how old we are," Kolya said with a half smile. Right. You two are... Well, let me think for a minute," Daniel said as he scratched at the stubble on his chin, purposely dragging out his response. "Oh, I know. You're 23. Both kids chuckled and protested his answer. "We're 12, Grandpa," Ashley said. "I knew that," Daniel said with a chuckle. "Well, 12 isn't 23, but I expect you're still old enough to hear the stories about that castle. Now, before I get started, you both finished your homework, right?" "We're done," both kids answered in unison. "And your parents don't need you for anything, right?" he asked. Both shook their heads and he gestured for them to sit down. Kolya and Ashley sat down on the couch and waited intently as Daniel grabbed his cup of coffee and leaned back in his chair. He took a drink and cradled the cup in his hands for a moment before setting it back down. He pulled his pipe from his pocket and stuffed it. He pulled a small, silver-capped, cobalt-blue cylinder from the same pocket and flicked the silver cap open. An almost liquid-looking green flame fell from its end as he tipped the cylinder over the bowl of the pipe. A second later, pale magenta smoke began rising from his pipe. He flipped the lighter shut and returned it to his pocket. Daniel took a few puffs on it, with thin clouds of glowing purplish magenta smoke lifting into the air above him before they dissipated. "All right, you two. Hope you're comfortable, because this is a very long story." There's a legend about that castle and the lords that lived there that starts long ago. Their family ruled this land for generations, but we have to start before they came to rule, before the division of reality, and before the last war. Before the last war had begun, the castle had been abandoned and was only a place for people on holiday to visit. They'd come from all over the world to see its ruins and spend time there. But tensions started between many of the countries that existed back then, and a lot of people stopped traveling. Aspiring warlords pushed and prodded tensions and generated chaos among people on every level of society. This was back when people divided themselves on the basis of ridiculous, meaningless things. The last war didn't have a grand start, or even really a defining point of beginning for that matter. For most of the old world, the last war began without them even knowing. In the earliest years, already existing divisions grew ever deeper. The last war was well underway before anyone had a chance to stop it. Or rather, that is what they believed back then at least. It raged for years and years. Alliances were forged and shattered. Entire countries were wiped from the face of the planet with simple gestures. As the last war raged, the world sorted itself into defining powers, united in their various and changing causes. The world had divided into 3 major ruling countries and a few outlying territories that were either battlegrounds or were neutral zones. The 2 most powerful conquered and divided the smaller third power, so that now only 2 ruling forces devastated the earth. There were legends that demons and monsters had begun roaming the world. One legend spoke of a demon from the skies that was trapped on earth, and he had taken charge of a child that was born half demon. Many argued that they helped bring the world to war, but others vehemently argued to the contrary. As the last war had grown stronger, the demon and the child fought to stop the fighting. They took refuge in the destroyed cities and wastelands created by the last war. We know this to be fact now. At some point, when things got to be so bad, the demon and the half-demon child fled to Antarctica, taking many people with them. Antarctica, which we call Inereland today, became a wasteland for those seeking to escape the conflicts altogether. It had become the only place of sanctuary on the planet, Earth's beacon of peace to the dying world round it. The 2 ruling powers, Meropia and Rusalia, had at one point tried to stop Inereland from becoming a threat, but it was too late. Some powerful people had made Inereland their home and helped it to grow into a solid, safe ground capable of defending itself. It had better technology and more efficient weapons. Inereland, however, only used its weapons and technology as a self-defense to protect itself. This confused the leaders of Meropia and Rusalia. Inerelands never sought to join in their war, which had become a part of everyday life for the citizens of the rest of the world. Anerlans would send messages of peace and open arms, but would destroy any threat to its people and its borders in its tracks. Rumors of Anerlan spies and saboteurs became part of the normal propaganda for the rest of the world. Sympathizing with Anerlan views became punishable by death by anyone's hands. This meant that if you suspected your neighbor, friend, or family member of being a sympathizer or an Anerlan spy, then you had not only the right, but the civil responsibility of killing them in the name of your country. You need only to be able to explain your suspicions, however vaguely, to any official. Anerlan had presented itself as a new power without even realizing it. A power that didn't want to rule the world like Meropia and Rosalia. Anerlan had become a threat. Anerlan had to be stopped. You would think that Meropia and Rosalia would unite and join forces, right? Well, they didn't. They still kept up the fighting with each other. The endless bombings, cloning soldiers, and breeding programs that gave the front lines endless fodder for their enemies. They still kept up with the control of their people's minds and hearts. The two powers secretly did conspire in one way that was both small and colossal at the same time. Meropians and Rosalians had sciences that had been around from before the beginning of the last war started, that were once meant for discovery, but were now being weaponized against Anerlan. The scientists involved developed a weapon that they claimed would rid the world, rid the planet, rid the war of Anerlan. No one knows exactly what it was, only that the weapon was used. It and its creators were destroyed once it had been deployed. Those that survived all told the story of when the skies changed and when the planet ripped apart beneath their feet. They told of, "Time for dinner," Kolya and Ashley's father yelled from the dining room. Daniel stood up with a grunt, his hand shaking a little as he grasped his cane, and began to leave the room, gesturing for the kids to follow. "Well, time to stuff our faces," Daniel said as he shoved his pipe back into his pocket. The children protested greatly over the interruption, which prompted responses from both their parents. "Grandpa, tell us what happened next," Ashley pleaded. She jumped to her feet and ran to stand in front of Daniel. "Yes, what happened next?" Kolya, now standing next to his sister, added. Now, don't be like that," Daniel said as he put his hands on their shoulders. "I'll tell you after dinner." Both kids groaned and sulked as they were ushered towards the living room door by their grandfather. As they reached the doorway, their grandmother on their father's side walked by and smiled warmly at them. "What have you three been talking about?" she asked. "Well, Liara, I was beginning the story about the old castle," Daniel explained. "Grandma, he hadn't told us anything about it," Kolya said. "He was telling us about the last war," Ashley followed. "He was about to tell us about the division of reality," Kolya continued. Liara looked sad for a moment, but then she smiled and looked happy as she gazed down upon her grandchildren. For a moment she said nothing as different emotions subtly passed over her. Daniel reached out, taking her hand in his, and spoke. "It's okay, Liara. This is why we preserve our past so truly. It's time for them to know how the world came to be the way it is now. I know it's painful, but it's vital that history isn't forgotten. Just as vital that it isn't repeated," Liara said, completing the phrase. It was the same phrase, word for word, that she and him had heard when they were children from their elders. For this brief time of recollection and remembrance, Liara and Daniel hadn't noticed the intrigued and confused children standing next to them. However, a reminder that it was time to eat broke the moment, and they both returned their attention to the children. As they walked down the hallway, they listened to the children speculating about part two of the history of their current world. As everyone was taking their seat at the table, the twins both looked at Daniel. "You promise to finish the story after dinner?" Ashley asked. "No," Daniel said, "but I will continue it." "Why can't you finish it?" Kolya asked, somewhat upset. "Our history is a very long one," Liara said. "I told you," Daniel said, smiling.